Welcome to the program. My guest is Claudia Rosett. She is a policy fellow with the Independent Women's Forum, a former foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and she is in Charlottesville speaking at the East Asia Center at the University of Virginia. I'm so glad that we could arrange this and that you are here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Coy. It's great to be here.
I want to get your thoughts about China. Let's begin with China, where you worked for many, many years. And Claudia, we recently passed the anniversary of the massacre in Tienanmen Square. You were there that night and those days out in the square with the students, with the protesters. What was that like? Tell us what the massacre was like. And what crosses your mind on the anniversary, looking back now, years later?
That was the most haunting story that I've ever covered. And we are now 27 years out. Why do we still care? It was because it was absolutely monumental. What was it like in the 67-year history of the People's Republic of China? That's the only time that the people of China have actually had a chance to freely speak up, to speak to the world, to speak to each other. Remember, they live under a government that will not let them do that to this day. They're punished, they're jailed, their Nobel laureate lives under house arrest.
People still disappear.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's very dangerous to really speak your mind. It's a country really without private newspapers. Think about that. And there came this moment in 1989 when it was basically a mass uprising. It wasn't simply a student protest. What you saw when you were there is that this wasn't simply student demonstrators. These were people from many walks of life. You know, the generic term has been workers, people who worked in factories. There were people who came in from farms. There were people of middle age. There were old people. And it was especially remarkable because this was before the fall of the Soviet Union. So the Cold War still hadn't ended.
Yeah.
It's 1989. It would be another 2 years before the Soviet Union collapsed. And
this was happening all over the country, right? I mean, it's not just in America. We think it was just students and it was just in Beijing, but it was millions of people all across the country.
It was in the major cities, basically, is where it was happening. On the farms, they were watching. A lot of people knew about this. They were sort of watching, waiting to see. But in major cities, certainly Beijing, we know that. But in Shanghai, where they built their own goddess of democracy statue. Remember, they built the Statue of Liberty in Beijing, which stood for 5 days before the army knocked it down when they retook Tiananmen. Shanghai, they did the same thing. In Chengdu, they had demonstrations. In China's southern province, Canton, we now call it Guangzhou, they had demonstrations. It was really mass thing. It was millions of people all over China, and people were coming from the provinces into Beijing as more and more as these protests went forward.
Was there a real sense among the people, you think, this is it? The time has finally come. We're going to have some measure, or was there a sense that, well, we'll do this, but nothing's going to change, really? What level of hope was there?
It was an incredible gamble, and one of the things that was so moving is it was a dangerous gamble. It was high risk. They really didn't know what a lot of them figured, what they suspected when you talked to them on the ground there, was that they were not going to get away with it. That it was like they made a run for this thing. What they wanted, here are the things that they said they wanted. They wanted justice. And I don't just mean the students. There were people I interviewed there who wanted to be treated decently in their jobs. You know, one thing that comes to mind is a middle-aged woman who beckoned me aside after one of the student demonstrations to say her husband was in prison because someone at his work unit didn't like him and had given sort of nasty information. He'd been arrested and detained. And there was no place she could go to appeal. There was no real justice in China. Okay? She said, please put this in your newspaper. Maybe it will help. I said, I don't think it will, but I'll, But it was people who wanted truth. They were living under such a load of official lies, which is the way of it in dictatorships. They wanted the truth told. Yeah, they wanted democracy. A lot of them were very well aware in the major cities of some notion of what American democracy was like. These people went around suddenly, when they could speak freely, it turned out they'd read the Gettysburg Address, quoting Abraham Lincoln. They built that statue of democracy. At the same time, they were certainly very well aware that their own government had, as it still does, an enormous repressive apparatus, secret police, tremendous power to crack down, that tens of millions in China had died in past years because of the government's machinations to keep control, including the Cultural Revolution. But here's what sort of sums it up. When that statue of democracy was being built, I spent the night watching this in Tienanmen Square. It was an amazing scene. What a defiance in the heart of the world's most populous communist state, where the government for 2 weeks lost control of its capital city. That was a staggering historic thing at the time. And I spent part of it talking with this young Chinese medical student who was talking to me about how we want democracy. And I said at the end, may I meet you again to talk more? He said, yeah, okay. And I said, why don't we meet here by the statue of democracy, the Chinese goddess of liberty? And he said, no. He said, this might not be here in a week. He said, let's meet. More prudent to say, let's meet over there. And he pointed to the huge picture of Mao that hangs over Tiananmen.
Oh my gosh.
And in other words, they knew.
They knew.
They knew. And one person after another, early in that whole scene, the Chinese army tried to drive into the city 2 weeks before June 4th and was stopped by people coming out to surround their troop trucks. Okay. Some nights after that, they withdrew. And for a few nights, you had this eerie scene of all these Chinese civilians, Beijingers, people who lived in Beijing. Again, not just students, people with their kids in some cases, surrounding these troop trucks at these overpasses on the edge of Beijing where they'd stop them. And there was one night I was out there looking at this scene, and the trucks started up their engines and backed out. They pulled away, they left. And the people stayed there. And I asked them, why don't you go home? You've achieved, the trucks are gone, the army's pulled out. And they said, we know they're coming back. So it was incredibly brave. They were taking a gamble. It was sort of the one chance. But a lot of them knew it was going to end with something terrible.
Did the horrific violence, did it surprise you? Or did you sort of feel all along, this is coming at some point?
It did not surprise me in the least. It was pretty clear that something like that was likely to happen.
Because that government it's got an incredible track record of being so brutal to its own people.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
And that's where it was clear that they were debating what to do. And it wasn't 100% clear what would happen. Okay, we really didn't know. When you get into the moment where a government has lost control of its capital, where you have, that's the thing with mass uprisings, they follow courses that are not always predictable. And remember, this came at a time, or those of you who aren't old enough don't need to remember, but just to know, when these sort of democracy waves had been sweeping across Asia. The Philippines had overthrown the dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Taiwan had lifted martial law.
It was like their own Arab Spring kind of thing.
It was an Asian Spring. These Asian countries, South Korea had held genuine elections. They'd gotten rid of their dictatorship. Burma had tried it. Burma was the other side. Burma in 1988, without the TV cameras there, so it didn't make quite the same as China, had a big uprising. The Burmese government slaughtered them. They killed thousands.
It was horrific,
China had both potential ways to go. Of course, China was communist. That made it far more repressive than, say, a Taiwan or a South Korea dictatorship had been. That made it far more likely that they were going to slaughter people, which is what they did.
Let me ask you this. How should the West, how should Americans understand China today? What should we really understand about this country, where they're going, what the plans are? You and I have spoken before about how China plays a long game, and they're good at it. America's not good at the long game. We don't even really play it.
No, we seem to have a hard time getting beyond last week and next week at the moment. But with China, I think it comes down to this. China still, to this day, could go either way. You have a country full of people who would like to join the modern world. And economically, they've come very, very far. You know, in 1989, Tienanmen, it was still desperately poor after decades of real communist rule. China's no longer really communist in how it's configured. It's much more an authoritarian dictatorship where the state controls a lot and the state controls what's said. But there's, I believe, still a real yearning there to be a country where the people actually hold the government accountable. However, people need to believe in something, okay? They really need to believe in whatever the age of the world, whether it's communism in its first flush, whether it's a desire for democracy, whether it's religious. In China, they have been blocked from finding this outlet that so many people were asking for, were demanding in 1989. Give us truth, justice, democracy, you know, let us have. And over today, the Chinese government tries to channel that yearning into nationalism.
Right.
Into we're the best, we're going to be the next great power. So you have an increasingly militaristic China, a China that says, where they sort of look to countries that have troubles internally in dictatorships, love to deflect it to wars, threats, trouble on the border. We're seeing that kind of behavior.
And that's what they're
now.
doing.
Yeah.
Imperial expansion into the seas. They're in Africa. I mean.
Yeah, exactly. What could the U.S. do? My own view, this is an opinion, but is we should be pushing back much, much harder. We should be drawing real red lines and saying, you don't jockey for your place in the South China Sea. You don't try to sort of export the values of a government that would slaughter and imprison its own people for doing something like that's protected under our Constitution.
Right.
It's actually we regard as a fundamental human right, free speech.
What's the timidity? Is it just politics? Is it corporate America that doesn't want to lose customers and deals? What is it?
It's both. China's very good at manipulating business to try and make sure that people don't threaten the style of the government. You have one-party rule there. And, you know, again, it's not actually communist in the way it operates today, but it is certainly despotic, okay?
Right.
And the party protects its interests and will go far to say, you're friendly to us, you get that contract, you're not, you lose it. Unfortunately, we even see that kind of pressure brought to bear on academic institutions in a lot of places.
Yeah.
The other part is, there's been, I think, a great timidity on the part of the U.S. administration. I'd say starting in the second term of President Bush and proceeding through all 7 years under President Obama, where we've been substantially in retreat. You know, there have been a few instances where you can say the U.S. pushed back. There was the surge in Iraq during the final years of President Bush. Drone strikes, I guess, under President Obama. But in the main, we have pulled back, and things like right now, seriously depleting the U.S. Navy, which is vital for projecting power in the Pacific, sends a message to China that says, come and get it.
Yeah, have at it in the South China Sea, which is exactly what they're doing.
Which is exactly right.
Yeah. Let me ask you about, I want to change gears and ask you about Iran, because I know you've done a lot of reporting on Iran, and you've recently broke some news regarding payments to the Iranian government from the Obama administration, the Treasury Department sending money to the State Department, and there was the well-publicized cash delivery, hundreds of millions of dollars sent to Iran. How should we make sense of this? What's going on?
What's going on is our government did something, I think, extremely foolish and reckless. Effectively, I'm just going to describe to you the effect, and then we can go into politically, how was it sold, how was it framed. Yeah. Effectively, they used a tribunal in The Hague to launder a payment of $1.7 billion in cash to the Iranians, whatever the reason. That's really bad because Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. You know, you don't want them to have that kind of cash. Cash is useful for buying things under the table. There's a reason drug dealers
use it. Like nuclear weapons.
Like nuclear weapons from North Korea. Like funding Hezbollah, the terrorist group that basically runs Lebanon. Like funding Hamas, the terrorist group in Gaza. Like, recall the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the elite military force in Iran, which just a few years ago was plotting to blow up the Saudi ambassador in a Washington restaurant with phone conversations that included, don't worry about collateral damage. I mean, that was us, right? This is Iran, which has the record of murdering Americans, not least, from the Marine barracks in Beirut to people in attacks by Hezbollah around the world to, anyway. You really don't want to be giving them cash. And okay, here's officially what happened. There's a tribunal that was set up in sort of remember the Islamic Revolution was in 1979.
Yep.
They took American diplomats hostage at our embassy that November. And there proceeded the whole mess during the final days, months of Jimmy Carter, President Carter, which ended the day before President Carter left office with the Algiers Accords, which spelled out that there would be all sorts of swaps would be done. We'd get the hostages back, and there would be a tribunal set up in The Hague in the Netherlands to resolve financial disputes between the US and Iran, okay? That operated still in operation, and by the mid-90s, all the private claims back and forth had been settled, leaving only government-to-government claims. This tribunal operates with enormous secrecy, which is hard to defend given that it's now government-to-government. We're not protecting individual privacy anymore.
Yeah.
And in the course of doing the Iran nuclear deal, the Obama administration decided to negotiate a settlement of one of many claims that Iran has made against the US.
Iran saying, America, you owe us money.
Correct.
And is this money that was theirs, the government's money in American banks, for example, that we froze when they took our embassy workers and hostages?
Well, not quite close, but it sort of, the question is how to describe it. Here's what it was. Under the Shah, which was a different regime in Iran.
Yeah.
So, you could debate whose money properly was it. This was $400 million that had been deposited in a Pentagon trust fund to deal with arms deals. Iran was buying weapons from the United States under the Shah. Okay, that deal fell apart. After the Islamic Revolution, they couldn't make their payments, and then we broke off relations because they had taken our diplomats hostage. And that was
arguably it was a different government after the overthrow of the Shah.
Yeah, in fact, I would argue that. That would be my argument.
But they were insisting that it was the same government.
Correct.
Even though it was the guy they overthrew.
Exactly.
And they wanted that money.
And
President Obama gave it to him.
Exactly. Before the tribunal, they said, that's our $400 million. President Obama cut a deal where he said, okay, you can have that back. Plus, they said, we want interest on it. He said, well, it has not been in an interest-bearing account, or that was the gist of the deal, apparently. But we'll pay you $1.3 billion. That will be the interest, a negotiated sum. That came out of American tax dollars' pockets. You paid for that. Actually, on average, every man, woman, and child in America, on average with that sum, bought the government of Iran a large Starbucks coffee for that deal. I mean, like basically $4 a piece is what we sent there. This was shipped in cash.
And this comes at the same time that President Obama is trying to negotiate this well-publicized, at least for the Obama administration, much celebrated treaty with Iran.
Yes.
We're essentially paying Iran for this treaty.
Yeah.
Which many critics have argued really isn't, what does it do?
You're making an assumption that would be consistent with the American Constitution that it was a treaty. Actually, President Obama never submitted it as a treaty. So it isn't even a treaty. The Senate never got to ratify this nuclear deal. President Obama basically sent it to the United Nations and said they've approved it. It never even came to a vote in Congress. He just said, UN has approved it, the deal is done, I'm signing, we didn't sign it either. Nobody signed it. It's a very bizarre deal. But yes, concurrent with that, this settlement was reached. And then along what we were told was yet another track, there were these Americans who had been held prisoner in Iran under horrible conditions. And President Obama announced that they were coming home as a prisoner swap. Well, $400 million in cash reached Iran from the settlement the same day that the prisoners were released. The State Department, this was all kept secret by the administration for months.
I remember that.
Wall Street Journal finally broke the story that was cash in August. And the Obama administration State Department then finally admitted, yes, in fact, the cash was used as leverage to make sure our prisoners were released. Well, Congress is now saying that was ransom. The administration is saying, no, it wasn't. Leverage to me suggests ransom. Then we discovered, my piece of this was finding where they'd broken out the payments from our 1.3 billion in tax dollars in a database at the Treasury Department, which listed them as 13 separate payments for $99,999,999.99 a piece, which if you or I did it would be a crime called structuring. But anyway.
And that's payments that the Treasury Department was sending over to the state to send to Iran.
These were payments that were exactly, as we now know, because finally, after weeks, the administration finally confirmed, and then in congressional hearings this past week, finally told us more. Yeah. The administration wired that money to a bank in Europe, which turned it into foreign currency and then flew in two rounds. That cash, as well as the 400 million, into Iran, or arranged for was delivered it to the Iranians. So Iran received 1.7 billion in presumably untraceable hard currency.
From the Obama administration.
Yes, which then told us it was probably going to be used to fix for infrastructure. Coy, countries don't pay their road repair workers in foreign currency. They pay it in domestic currency. Hard currency like that, there's only one reason a country like Iran would fly it in, and that is to parcel it out off the radar and send it for illicit uses somewhere else. I mean, possible they are dumb enough to do something different with it. It's possible that they're paying their sewer repair guys.
But it's highly probable that the $1.7 billion payment that the Obama administration orchestrated to secretly send to Iran is being used to fund terrorism around the world and kill Americans.
Quite likely. I even would ask the question, is it being used to do things like buy nuclear technology from North Korea?
Yeah. We've only got a few minutes left.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate you being here. But given all of this, China, Iran, how should we understand the current election? How should we understand Clinton versus Trump? How should we make sense of that? What should we be thinking about? Given everything you know and you've experienced around the world, what's your advice? America, be thinking about this.
The stakes are absolutely enormous. I mean, this country, I think, is in real trouble right now. President Obama, unfortunately, in his many historic moments during his presidency, has delivered us a historic obliviousness to what the Constitution actually requires. Things like a nuclear deal with Iran without ever seeking the Senate ratification as a treaty. Right. The reasons that the Constitution provides these checks and balances on anyone's behavior. Our economy is really in dismal shape. 1% growth is not, on average,
that's
is not
growth
what
for oligarchs. It's not growth for the rest of us.
Yeah, that's more like the Marcos Philippines. That's right. And there is, in fact, this sort of well-heeled elite, if you like, that lives well off Washington. And worldwide, where we've got real trouble. There's been an open invitation, as we were talking about before, as President Obama has diminished, has reduced the size of the military, has pulled back, saying we're not going to interfere here, delegated the Middle East to Russia, basically. Vladimir Putin is now calling the shots in Syria. We're asking Russia's permission for things there. Has let Russia get away with simply swallowing Crimea, which belonged to Ukraine, and pushing the envelope with the rest of Ukraine. We've got a lot of, this is a moment of real opportunism by some very bad actors, both countries and the
tyrants,
the proliferation of terrorist groups. And we do need a leadership that's going to take that into account. Now, how to characterize the two candidates? I don't know. I think it sort of comes down to Hillary Clinton is, to my mind, a pretty well-known quantity, and both, I think, not a politician I would characterize as honest. And from the cattle futures to the vast right-wing conspiracy to Benghazi and the video to the emails, on and on, there's a major problem there, and it's also one of very bad judgment. Donald Trump is really an unknown. It's been hard to pin down just what's going on there and where he would take, we don't know. Tough gamble, but I think it comes down to whether you think the country is going to have a better chance at protecting and redeeming itself under a known major problem versus a gamble of something that might go either way. And that really comes how you choose on that one.
Doesn't sound like a winning choice.
Well, it's not quite the election I had in mind. I was hoping for. I do know that what we need is something that restores. Here are the things we need. We need respect for the Constitution to be a hallmark of the president.
Yeah.
That's vital, because when you start pushing that, it's very hard for the country to stop a president who sort of treats it as the rule is that whatever he can get away with, he will.
Well, Nixon,
Yeah.
And the founders wrote extensively about this concern about an imperial presidency. We have to avoid the possibility of what they called monarchy and what we might call just, an imperial presidency.
Basically, it's been flipped inside out over the last few years. We were sort of a country built on laissez-faire capitalism at home and policing the world, at least since World War II, abroad, and that worked out pretty well. We've now had pretty much laissez-faire abroad, if not actually the enabling of places like Iran and Russia, not assistance to our enemies, and incredible rising control at home, where people are trying to figure out how do they pay their medical bills that were supposed to be affordable. We need to reverse that again.
Yeah.
That's what I would say on the next election, Coy.
There you go. Claudia, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for all the work you do. Claudia Rosett is in Charlottesville speaking at the East Asia Center at the University of Virginia. I'm Coy Barefoot. You can find the complete archive of our program online at Media and Citizenship.org. Have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other.